What's up YouTube, Capital G here, doing a boomer bust on kaijus in this video. I know this video has probably been overdue, but you got to think about it. When kaijus premiered in Clash of Rebellion as a TCG exclusive archetype, if I'm not mistaken, they only launched with 3 cards and they only have 9 support cards to their name. In fact, I would say that this archetype is developing extremely slow, and that's probably an understatement. They've only been getting 3 cards per set, but I would expect them to get at least one more set of competitive, or I would expect it for them to get one more set of support. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the play set or the play style of kaijus, it essentially revolves around tributing a monster on your opponent's side of the field to summon a kaiju on their side of the field in attack position. Then you do the same thing for your side of the field, except, well, you don't have to tribute a monster. You just special summon a kaiju on your side of the field in attack position, and then essentially you want to have your monsters battle, and you want to make sure that you have the most powerful monster, obviously, and then you use that monster, you use its appropriate effects, and then you'll generally just rely on your back row to control your opponent. Now the thing is, these monsters are all really big. I mean, these guys go up to freaking 3,300 attack, so if you can get a couple of direct attacks through with these guys, you can end the duel extremely fast. The problem with their playstyle means that you put a lot of stress on that one monster to kind of do everything, which is why the traps in this deck are so important, because anything that one monster can't cover, your traps your traps had better cover. Otherwise, once you lose that monster, you're generally going to have an exposed field if you're not running things like Call of the Haunted or Oasis of the Dragon Souls to immediately summon that monster back. But it puts a lot of pressure on your monster kind of to be your offense, your defense, disrupt your opponent's plays, do everything, and make sure that your opponent isn't stalling you, because you're probably only going to be getting 1 attack per turn if you're running a pure kaiju variant, which is why a lot of players don't run pure kaiju variants. Now there are some there are some kaijus that have some kind of, I guess, play disruptor kind of stun effects. The main one is Sea Turtle. This guy is essentially a walking Solemn Judgment. It's even better than Solemn Judgment in this deck because it banishes the card, so it's really good against like pendulum monsters. When your opponent activates a pendulum, you can just banish the card because, again, it counts as activating a spell. Now all of these effects, and they can be used, a lot of them can be used during both players' turns, they rely on kaiju counters. There are only 2 cards right now that can actually accumulate kaiju counters. That is Kaiju Waterfront, and that is Kaiju Capture Mission. Now the good thing about these 2 is they can accumulate counters during your opponent's turn. In fact, with Waterfront, your opponent actually helps you accumulate the counters, because anything that goes to the graveyard from the field accumulates kaiju counters. But it's a double-edged sword, because your opponent can use kaiju counters from your side of the field. So I mean, it seemed like a blessing, but sometimes it can be like something that inherently will help your opponent, or I guess inadvertently help your opponent, because if you ever give your opponent this monster and they start activating the effect, you're probably going to lose. In fact, a lot of times I see people give Sea Turtle to their opponent, and if they don't have a way of immediately taking the card back, then it can be a very bad situation, because you're either forced to run over your Sea Turtle, which in my opinion is the best kaiju monster, or just find a way of like baiting its effect out and then taking it or negating it or something like that. Now this leads me to one of the huge problems that kaiju suffer. They did not give this deck an innate way to take their monsters back. I have no idea why. I kind of think that Konami designed this deck for the monsters to constantly be battling, but that's just not how Yu-Gi-Oh's played in 2016, let alone 2015 when these guys started coming out. We know that the best way to deal with monsters is just to fucking not even attack them, just to get them off the field by spinning them or blowing them up or putting them back in your opponent's hand, and then saving your attacks for direct attacks so you can just kill your opponent. Kaijus really don't have that luxury except for one card, Mad Flame, which it is a Regeki. This card is actually really good. If you have kaiju counters, you can use it as a Regeki, hit your opponent for 3,000. But again, after that, you're kind of limited to doing anything. So the problem always arises with kaijus, and if you play the deck long enough, it will happen where you give your opponent a monster and then you don't really have a way of taking it back, or you don't have a kaiju that's bigger than it. You know what I mean? So I mean, you'd like to think, well, why don't you just keep the bigger kaiju for yourself? But yeah, but sometimes if you try and summon your kaiju, it might fall into a bottomless trap hole, or to a Solemn Strike or something like that, because kaijus don't have really any back row destruction. So they're kind of at their opponent's mercy when you try and summon these big guys. The only card that they have to essentially stop your opponent's kaijus from killing you is Capture Mission, which is not searchable, and something like Sea Turtle can completely just like negate the card and banish it. So again, you have to always be careful about this card. Now, ideally, your playstyle would be to get this card in defense position and kind of create a game state where you're just using it to grind your opponent, take their cards, try and grind them out until you feel comfortable putting this guy in attack mode. It's easier said than done, because either you have to give your opponent a bigger kaiju and then special summon this in attack mode, as it has the lowest attack out of all the kaijus, or you have to give it to your opponent and try and take it back somehow, which as I said earlier is a problem, because kaiju don't have any innate ways of getting their monsters back. You know, there are cards like Remove Brainwashing, there's also Kama 1, Neospatian Granimal, there's all the Great Old effects that can take your monsters back. But if your opponent has if your opponent has this and its effect is live, they don't have like a lose one, there's no lose one turn or skill drain on the field, your opponent can just try and negate whatever the hell you're trying to use to take it back. So you always have to be kind of wary. Like, you kind of have to be really cautious when using this card, because if you're not smart, this card will kill you just as much as it actually will help you. The second problem with kaijus, and it's actually the bigger one, is the fact that you can only control one kaiju monster. This goes for both players, and it's a real bitch, because it means that you can never really advance your game state with kaijus themselves as long as you control a kaiju. Like, you often find yourself drawing too many kaijus, and you know, even if you have this on board and you're controlling your opponent, there's no follow-up play. You can't do any more damage, which is why you often see people run like Yosenjus and Greatles, so they have other cards that they can summon and do more damage. But in a pure kaiju variant, you just don't have any way of, like, you're just kind of at the deck's mercy. You don't have any way of doing that. There are no kaiju extra deck monsters, even though a lot of these guys are level 8. You know, well, because of that restriction, they couldn't make Xyz. But I mean, they could have even given the deck like tuners, made a non-kaiju tuner, or made like a non-kaiju tuner and gave the deck synchros or something like that. But considering that restriction is built into the deck, there's no way of ever OTKing your opponent. There's no way of having battle phases where you'll do more than like 3,000 damage just using kaijus. And it's really frustrating, because it feels like the deck often has to spend like 3 or 4 turns to do the same amount of damage that a deck like Mermill or Cosmo or Pepe would do in one battle phase, where they can special summon as many monsters as they want. When it comes to adding the counters to things like Waterfront, I do find this to be fairly consistent. Waterfront is a card that not only lets you use your kaiju monsters effects, but it also gives you replenishment. It lets you search kaiju monsters, although it should have been kaiju cards. It lets you search your kaiju monsters so that you never really run out of steam for the deck. You never should run out of kaijus. You can generally use things, if you're not using Greatles or Yosenju and you're building a pure build, you can generally use draw cards like Upstart Goblin, Pot of Duality, Magic Planter. Those will not only send themselves to the graveyard, but they'll give you another card to activate. Things like Magic Planter will send 2 cards to the grave, which is pretty good, because as soon as you get 3 counters on this card, you can start searching, and if this card would be destroyed, you just remove a counter instead. And this works during both players' turns, so a lot of times this card will max out at 5 within like a turn or so. To be honest, I don't even think they should have put a max on this card. Like, I've had games where I could have accumulated like 13 tokens or 13 counters on it, and I mean, if I get 13 counters, so what? Like, the card basically just becomes indestructible. But at least that way, you know, I'd be able to use this card like 8 times in a turn. Like, that would have been fantastic if I could just negate every single play that my opponent does. Now, since this deck suffers from being slow, it suffers from having kind of a really bad early game, assuming that, especially if you have to go first because you can't summon any kaiju monsters as your opponent doesn't have any monsters, I wouldn't recommend this for high levels of play. I find that other decks are way more consistent, and I don't think that the pure build is, I don't think it's ever really going to be competitive because of the restriction of one kaiju per field. In fact, it's even worse than something like the level rank restriction with Infernoids, where at least Konami built ways to kind of play around that with things like Void Imagination and with monsters that have a lot of attack but are not effect monsters, things like Scrap Archfiend and Gem Knight Pearl. There's no real way to get around this. Even things like Skill Drain don't actually get around the restriction. I think that the better variants are Yosenju and Grado variants because they have innate ways of taking your monsters back in case, you can't actually run over your monster. You can play things like the Grados, which can pop back row with impact, and then you can take your monster back forcibly if you don't have like remove brainwashing. Comma 1 is a card that spins monsters. At the same time, those decks give you supplemental offense so that you don't have to solely rely on your kaijus. At this point, I would say kaijus need more ways of getting their monsters back, and they need more stun cards. Like, they need more cards like Sea Turtle, and I don't even think that there's a benefit of having a card that searches out the spells and traps at this point because there's just so few of them. There's only 2 actual kaiju spells or traps. Waterfront isn't technically a kaiju card. I would also think that they need like some type of draw card. Like maybe if they had a trade-in that it could banish itself from the graveyard to let you draw another card, that would give the deck like a draw 3 and 1 turn. Kaijus are more or less just a fun deck at this point. The level restriction is the 1 card per field restriction is way too harsh. And one of the best things I will say, and I should have talked about this earlier about the deck, one of the biggest benefits is it doesn't really struggle against problem monsters. You're never really going to get locked out by a Naturia Beast or a Cyber Infinity or a Pallades, things like the Cosmo spaceships, things that can't be targeted, because when you do give your opponent a monster by tributing, they can't really respond to it in any way, and it doesn't target and it doesn't start a chain, so they've already lost their monster the second this thing hits the field. The only thing they can really respond to is the actual kaiju itself. So kaijus are a fun deck. It was an interesting concept, but it really, in my opinion, works better for like anime duels than it does for actual like real duels. So I would say that pure kaijus is an absolute bust, and I would say that Yosenju and Grado kaijus are closer to bust. They're more like fun decks. They suffer from getting their back row floodgate cards removed. They suffer from inconsistent hands. If they go first, the deck is beyond mediocre, and it's not nearly as fast as a lot of the meta decks, but it's still a very fun deck to play. I still do play this deck on stream a lot, or at least variants of it. So let me know what you guys think. Maybe you disagree. If you do, leave that in the comment section below. Thank you for watching as always.